I just figured out when I woke up in the hospital, this lifestyle, the beliefs that I'm operating on, they don't lead to happiness at all. Like, I've never been more unhappy. I'm about to lose everything that I thought would make me happy.
My guest today is Jord Cuiper. Jord is a self-leadership coach with over 10 years of experience in the field of entrepreneurship and coaching. I can honestly say that this was a truly moving and inspiring conversation. I've already re-listened to it and think I'll have to dive into it again. It is just jam-packed with powerful lessons and with wisdom. In this episode, we cover getting unstuck from self-sabotage, developing the courage to admit when your strategy isn't working, connecting with community and being vulnerable, leaning into the discomfort of growth, paying attention to resistance and the wisdom of the body, crossing the river of fear, and finally, taking advantage of this one wild and precious life that you have to live. Without further ado, please join me in this conversation with Jord Cuiper. All right. So, welcome to the Unhooked podcast. Welcome to my guest, Jord. Great to have you here. I'm just excited to dive into the work that you're doing, and hopefully you can, pass on some of the insights you've gained to my audience. I've been having a little bit of trouble of knowing where to start this because you talk about so many different things that all sound so resonant with things that I've struggled with. And so for someone who's kind of just tapping into this episode and thinking about whether or not they want to continue listening, what would you say is your mission? Who do you help and what are you doing on this planet these days?
Well, I try to help people from all walks of life. Like, I don't want to put them in boxes, but because of my background, I seem to attract most like entrepreneurs and high impact professionals. And what I help them with is really to help them see their own nonsense and to put them back into a place of self-leadership. And this has often taken place because they have achieving great things in their lives, but at a high cost. And they feel very much out of control. And it's taking that control back, taking the responsibility back for what they are responsible. And even if they're not responsible for it.
Yeah.
Because that's the plot.
Yeah, so taking ownership, taking that responsibility.
Yeah. Really, really stepping back into the driver's seat. After years and often more than a decade of doing what they should be doing, and then coming to the realization, shit, this is not giving me the confidence, the freedom, the health that I was hoping for. Which is a bit of realization for them.
Yeah.
And that's where I step in.
One of the quotes that I heard once that really stuck with me is, your mess is your message. And it's like knowing that some of the stuff that you've gone through and you've overcome is what you're here to help people with. And so, we don't need to go too much into your past story, but I am curious just, what is it that happened in your own life that got you into this line of work?
I think there's not just one story to it. It's like I grew up very privileged and I've experienced also tremendous trauma in my life. And both can be true at the same time. So I don't have like this full victim story that everything was bad. I'm very much white privileged. My parents are still together. They love each other. They've always been there for me. We grew up very middle class and my dad did very well. So I've had a great role model, a self-made man. So those were all the great things. And at the same time, from a very young age in school, I struggled. I didn't feel like I was fitting in. I felt very much suppressed by how I had to behave at school. And I was standing out in different things, but there was no space for it within the current education system. So I think that's where the first struggle started, where I thought, hey, I'm different. I don't belong. And at the same time, I started playing hockey from a very young age on. And from day one, I was really good and better than the other people. Which taught me is like, hey, when I'm the best, people like me wherever I go. And people start clapping, people want to be my friends. And I went from one hockey club to another. And And I just repeated that same coping mechanism, because every time I arrived at a new club, I was a kind of a threat to the other people. I was this new guy who was taking over the team and whatsoever. But then within a few months, I was the popular one because I was the best. And again, I had friends, the girls liked me, people were clapping for me in the weekend. So all great. And I started like applying that pattern in every aspect of my life, is wanting to be the best at the expense of everything. At the expense of friendships, at the expense of my health. And another big thing that has led to who I am today is the sexual abuse that I've experienced when I was 15, 16. Something that I've kept below the radar for 18 years. I only started speaking up last year after my time in the Amazon, working with the Shipibo healers. That suppressed a big part of my masculinity. And again, like, just imagine, like, if you get sexually abused by a man, what the impact is on you, on your sense of self. And well, I can only speak for myself. For me, I felt very weak. I felt very much ashamed. I deep down thought that if people would figure out, they would judge me, they would humiliate me, they would reject me, they would abandon me. Mm-hmm. I even came home every night on a Wednesday night, and I would smile at my parents, and they were like, "Hey, how was it?" Because they thought I went to kickbox training. I did. But I also, at the same time, was abused. Mm-hmm. And then I said, yeah, it was great. So I was just lying, and there was always this big fear within me. If people will see me, they will think there's something wrong with me. And so I thought men would never respect me, and I thought women would never love me. So I had another reason to compensate, which added to that mechanism that I already developed. I need to be the best. I need to be one up. I need to be on top of the mountain for people to respect me and for women to love me. So again, continued applying that pattern, which worked pretty well for me. I didn't do too good in school or whatsoever, but I graduated from one of the best business schools here in the Netherlands. I had a few corporate gigs, and then I started my startup company, which skyrocketed. It was incredible success from the beginning onwards. It was hard work. It was not just only success. It was a lot of struggle too. But we did pretty well, especially considering I was only 24 years old for a first tech company. But when we raised the first investment, or when I raised the first big investment for the company, because at that time it was very much a one-man show with a few other people around me, but no co-founders yet. I woke up the next day after closing the investment round with a phone call from my best friend's mom that he had passed away. And that was like, it just shattered my world. That was something that I didn't know how to cope with, because it was such a tremendous amount of grief, loss. It was so overwhelming. And at the same time, I just raised an investment. And there was so much pressure, not just like pressure from the outside world, also the pressure that I was putting on myself to perform. And I felt, as the best friend from the guy who died, even more eyes are on me. So what happened? I thought I needed to perform even more. So I did. I just tried to outwork my grief, outwork my sadness. And I really thought that if I would just climb up that mountain at some point, I would earn the respect to finally grieve, to finally show emotions. And one of the big lessons that I learned from it is that it's just impossible to outwork, party, socialize, whatever, drug my emotions. And that started to, kind of like just eat me from the inside out. Until a moment where I was able to shift it myself. Like I was done seeing myself going down that slide of just working really hard, partying. And I started to lose touch with the meaningful friendship and just engaging in the more superficial ones people that I saw when I was like going out here in Amsterdam, having the crazy nights, being high on cocaine and all the shebang. And I managed to shift it around, and a big turning point there, which then another big thing in in becoming the man that I'm today is that I met my now ex-partner, who was pregnant at the time from another man who already left her. And that was such a big turning point because it just like accelerated the growth that I was already committed to. Like I got completely sober. I started to establish a healthier work-life balance. And I had the best intentions, but again, not knowing, I just jumped in the most impossible situation ever because her ex-husband started to sabotage the end, not just the relationship, just our lives so much that she eventually burned out to the ground, which led to us separating. And from one day to another, I wasn't able to see the little man that I committed my life to. And that got me, that just broke me down. That was the last thing that I could handle, like from losing my best friend, from growing my startup from zero to big, from committing to this little man and raising him to losing that. And I just lost the meaning of life. And my body knew it because 3 weeks later I ended up in the hospital with a blood poisoning, which turned into a near fatal health crisis. Spent weeks in the hospital.
This was from alcohol?
No, this was just a blood poisoning. And later it was, they figured out it was from a chronic inflammation from my appendix.
Wow. So your body just kind of gave you the signals like, hey,
my immune system just couldn't fight it off, and it was so weak. I just couldn't fight it off anymore. And that was the end of my story. That's where I became a nobody because I had to recover for months and months. But besides that, I just knew I can't go back to that way of living. That's just where it ended. It was such a deep knowing, and it was a sense of liberation because there was finally something so big in my life that allowed me to say, it's enough. That gave me the permission to say, guys, I gotta prioritize myself now. And what that looked like is that I stepped down as the CEO of the company. I sold my shares. After a few months of recovery, I decided to move abroad. I decided to go to Bali. Back then, less busy than it is right now. And very much focused on health. And I just wanted to distance myself to gain a new perspective. But most of all, I had been in personal development since the age of 14. I'd been working with coaches. I'd been working with psychologists due to certain events in my life that I just shared with you. And I thought at the age of 27, I know myself. And then this happened, which just shattered that illusion that I had that I even knew a little bit about myself. I was like, I only know this little. But apparently there's this huge chunk underwater that I don't know about myself that drove me almost to death.
I want to go back to that moment where you had this, because I think it's so resonant. I resonate with it a lot, and I know a lot of the listeners will. This moment in life where you have this recognition, I can't keep doing the same thing. I can't keep living the way I'm living, or I can't go back to this old way of living because it's not working. And it's this kind of rock bottom moment where you get to and you say, if I keep living this way, I'll end up dead or worse. And I just want to dive into that moment. Like, what was that turning point like for you?
It was a liberation. I still get that feeling. It was such a liberating feeling to grant myself the permission to prioritize myself, to finally just say it's enough. Because now I was actually weak and I couldn't do anything. I had a reason. But like you said, yeah, I lost my best friend in that car accident. And on his funeral, we played the song "Happy" from Pharrell. I even have the tattoo on my arm. Happiness is the truth. And I just figured out when I woke up in the hospital, this lifestyle, the beliefs that I'm operating on, they don't lead to happiness at all. Like, I've never been more unhappy. I'm about to lose everything that I thought would make me happy. And then in the hospital, like I was in quarantine, so every day, like either my parents came visit or my really close friends, and seeing the pain in their eyes was one of my biggest motivations to do things differently. Not only did I feel guilty towards my best friend for almost like wasting these years, like I always felt like I got a second chance here, like you can only live through me now, so I got to do it for us both. And I felt a guilt towards him. I didn't want to feel that unhappy, stressed, overwhelmed, anxious, lonely guy anymore that can only find like a sense of happiness in partying and whatsoever. But then the biggest thing was the pain that I saw in the eyes, especially from my parents. Like I was like, I never want to do this again to the people that matter to me, that love me, that care for me.
You've talked a lot on your own social media stuff about the realm of the hungry ghost.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering if you could explain what that means to you.
Yeah, I got like, it was my therapist here back in Amsterdam who introduced me to that concept. After all this happened, like when we were reflecting on it, like the question was just like, where was this hunger coming from? Why was I always craving more of everything? But then as soon as I had it, I was hungry again. I was just never fulfilled. And that's where he introduced this concept of the hungry ghost. I think which comes from Buddhism. And the way he explained it is that the hungry ghost he keeps on eating and eating and eating. And he never feels full. And therefore he eats more. And because of it, he becomes sick. And until he becomes sick, that's when he realizes that it doesn't matter how much he eats. He will only get more sick. So maybe he needs to figure out a different way.
Yeah. So you had a lot of trauma in the past, a lot of pain from the past, a lot of unhealthy coping mechanisms.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go to this rock bottom moment, which also kind of provides the foundation for you changing your life. And, you know, sometimes we need to get to that rock bottom moment to admit to ourselves that our strategy isn't working, that the success, the partying, the fame, the money isn't bringing us the happiness that we want. When you got to that moment and you finally had permission to say, hey guys, I can't do this anymore, I'm stepping down as CEO, what was next for you? You know, how did you move forward from that rock bottom?
I think what you said, I just want to repeat that word because it's really the first thing on the journey is to admit.
Mm-hmm.
To admit I've been wrong. I got it all wrong. That's the most essential part of the journey, is to admit. But it's really hard. And that's why I perceive my rock bottom moment such an enormous gift. Because there was no other way than to admit it. I had to face reality. And I truly believe is that the way to, whatever we call it, to awaken to our true self is when our coping mechanisms, when our persona, the thought of who we think we need to be, fails. It's not just struggling, it fails. And that way, looking back, it's been the biggest gift, because for me, this really meant like, it wasn't the most beautiful thing of me stepping down as the CEO and people clapping. It was public failure. He had to step down because of his health crisis at a critical point of the company. And I became a nobody because I had to recover at the same time. So I wasn't the guy that everyone knew me for that was able to bounce back. No, there was no bouncing back. It was just laying down on the ground. I had to move in back with my parents. They had to take care of me. I went back to being a child that relied on his parents. And that was a very a very humbling moment to become a nobody with no plans for the future, with no story, and just sitting with myself and with all the feelings, because there was no running away from it. I couldn't get off the sofa. I just had to rest, so I just had to be with my feelings. And I think that has still been one of the most transformational experiences for me, is to really just sit in my own shit and feel through it.
What was transformational about that?
Because it's everything that I've been avoiding, hiding from, scared to face, and suddenly it's just like, here it is, Jord. You tried everything to run away from it. Now sit with it.
Yeah. I love this idea that I've heard in many different contexts, but sometimes you have to let who you were die before you can let who you're going to become live. Like this concept of ego death, or letting your old way of life die.
Yes. And yeah, the ego, it is definitely an ego death. Like I said, the ego ideal, the coping mechanisms need to fill. And so the more pressure you put on those mechanisms, whether it's in a relationship or in business, the higher the chance of failing, the more struggle and resistance you experience, the more liberation you will have. And then the ego can die. And at the same time, there's something else really, really, really important is happening right there. Because for that to happen, to make it an integrative experience, we need to befriend the enemy within. And we need to stop seeing the ego as something bad, because below that ego ideal hides a younger part of us that has been scared, that has been insecure, that has felt that it didn't belong, that it didn't matter, that it wasn't accepted, that it wasn't loved. And that part is not something we need to defeat. That's not something that needs to die. It's something that needs to be held. It needs to be seen, it needs to be held, and it needs the other version, the more mature and the more intelligent and the more the conscious version of us, to say, hey, I see you, little dude. I'm here with you. I know you're scared. I understand your fears, but I'm here. And from now on, I'm taking the lead. Trust me, I will guide us through this, and I will never leave you alone. And that is so important, because otherwise we just run to the other side of the spectrum. And that's what you see happening nowadays a lot. And I call that the counter persona. So one persona dies by developing a counter persona to it. And all these burned out corporates, what they're doing, not all of them, but a lot of them, they become highly spiritual, and they start to suppress their drive. And everything that's around goals or money or competition is labeled as superficial and egoic, only to realize after a few years that they've been cut off from something very, very essential to them. And that happens when we don't integrate that part. And I often say, like, the integrative way is the middle way, is where we don't swing to the other side of the spectrum, which is often necessary for a bit, but that we then find our way back to the middle. Yeah. And that's often where we meet our authentic self.
Yeah. But sometimes the kind of this moving into spirituality goes a little too extreme, where it's another escape mechanism, where we're running away from the same pain, but just in a different form.
Yeah.
What I'm really hearing from you is this act of recognizing that all of these coping mechanisms, whether it's the alcohol, drugs, partying, success, fame, the underlying thing there is this hurt child that needs love and attention. It needs kind of your acceptance and your warmth rather than more suppression.
Yeah. Yeah, there are mechanisms that protect and shield us from facing the parts that we don't know how to face.
Yeah. One of the things that you've said is nothing ever changes until we have the courage to face what's going on within. And I know for a lot of the people listening, you said that admitting that you have a problem, admitting that your strategy isn't working is the most important step, but it's also one of the hardest. That kind of recognition, hey, I'm actually not leading myself in the right direction. How do you develop the courage to face those things?
That's such a good question. First of all, let's say to the listeners to give them some motivation. Because why on earth would you do it? Why do you want to tend towards your pain? No one wants it. Because especially if you can watch another porn episode, or if you can smoke another cigarette, or if you can get another beer, or you watch another series on Netflix to just keep your mind busy so that you don't have to feel it so easy. But the flip side to it is that the bar has never been lower. So if you want to stand out in this world, it has never been easier, because there are so many people that don't know how and do not have the courage to move through the discomfort of growth. So I just want to start with that, because otherwise, why do we want to do it? So besides that, you can liberate yourself from the struggle. It is an opportunity to truly stand out in your own way and to move out of survival towards a fully lived life, whatever that may mean. That could mean for one that they start traveling the world, and for another person, it means that they lower their expectations and have a far better balance in life and can be present for their children. It's different for everyone. But that's the first thing. And I actually think that it's really, really hard for people to develop that courage. Because we live in a society where we sweep it under the rug. That is the kind of mindset. And most people that we're surrounded by also encourage us and remind us to do that, because we have very, very little healthy role models around us. And even in my own coaching and the way I approach it, I kind of wait for people to reach a certain pain point. And so whenever I have them on a call for my programs, whether it's one-on-one or in the group, if I notice that they don't have enough pain yet, I just let them go. I'm not going to convince them. Then they need to experience what they need to experience.
You almost have to really feel your pain, and really, the pain is that driver.
Yeah, we just need to become so sick of our own struggle, of the way we lie to ourselves, of the way we're hiding and avoiding and escaping these things. And there comes a point where it's just I have enough. And I think that is the moment when people decide to change. And what I've learned, that they're just it doesn't matter what we say, if we shame people, if we guilt them, if we motivate them. The only thing that makes someone change is their own realization that they have to change.
Yeah, you can't help someone who doesn't want to help themselves.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting because that theme comes up so often in addiction, whether it's addiction or just any kind of transformational change, but just that feeling of being so sick of your own behavior, that waking up where you can't keep blaming other people, you can't point the fingers at anyone else. At some point you recognize, I'm so sick of my own, the way I'm showing up and my own role in this, that you have to change.
Yeah, and that's when it starts happening. And that's we come back to, that's when we're finally ready to admit. Without that, there is no change.
One of the questions that I struggle with a lot, because it's so much easier to practice recovery or to transform your life before you hit rock bottom. Because when you hit rock bottom, your resources are at your lowest sometimes. But it almost seems inevitable that you have to hit rock bottom before you can really, launch yourself. Is there any way to start it earlier, to really get that drive of, hey, this isn't working?
It really depends on how strong the attachment is to the ego ideal, to the persona. So I work with a lot of clients that don't have to hit the rock bottom. And that's also, I became the coach that I needed when I was 26 or 25, 24. I worked with coach, but I had never that coach that really confronted me, that really called me forward and just could see right through me. And I worked with some really good coaches and psychologists, but there was no one to just show it to me. So I wish I had that coach. And oftentimes when people say like, what kind of coach are you? Like, I'm the coach that I needed when I was younger.
Almost like the coach that won't let you get all the way to rock bottom, that's going to call you out on your bullshit before you get there.
Yeah.
And be that source of like holding up a real mirror to you and say, hey, don't run away from this.
Yeah. And I think the most beautiful thing that where I'm at now in my career is that people that are at that place, whether they're in the 20s, like I don't work very often with people in their 20s because they still have a bit to go before they get to that point. But I recently had a guy exactly in the same spot where I was, same age. And for me, I just felt so completed because he recognized something in me. He's like, I recognize myself in his story. I don't want to go there. So let's seek help. Let's reach out. And he's doing amazing. And he doesn't have to go rock bottom now. He doesn't have to step down as the CEO at some point. And yeah, he will have certain struggles, but he now has the awareness and tools to move through them. So it is definitely possible. And at the same time, I have also seen people reaching out, but with such a strong attachment to that ego idea, to the persona, is that the coaching is almost a feel-good mechanism for them to say, but I'm working on myself. But they're still repeating the same thing, and I cannot help but let them walk into, or basically run into that wall for them to experience the pain that they need to experience.
Yeah, I love this, this idea that you can't protect someone from suffering, and sometimes the most compassionate thing to do is to actually let them experience the suffering. That the more we try to protect people from that, it actually prevents them from learning those lessons.
100%. The best thing sometimes to do is to let them experience the consequences of their own behavior.
Yeah. What motivates you in life?
So much. First of all, like a really deep motivation is, and it still touches me, is like I don't want anyone to experience what I've experienced in my life. That's a really, really, really big motivator. And yeah, I just find it really hard walking around and seeing so many people struggle.
How would you describe what that feeling is?
It's almost a feeling of like, there's a sense of powerlessness when I look at it, because the problem is just so big, and it hurts me so much when, especially men, when they finally got the courage to reach out after years of suffering. Not just 2, sometimes 4, sometimes 6 years of feeling so isolated and using all sorts of very, very unhealthy coping mechanisms to deal with the tremendous stress and anxiety and loneliness and inadequacy that they feel on the inside. So that's a really, really big motivator for me. And another huge motivator, and I've never been further away from it, or maybe I'm closer to it because I just broke up with my beautiful ex-partner. But one of my greatest desires is to become a dad. And I just want to show them a role model. And not just me, also the people around me. That show them a different way of living, so that they step into this world with with healthier beliefs. And I know I can't prevent them from struggle and pain. They will have their own fair share of pain. But I grew up with a great role model, my own father. And that's just a responsibility that I carry. Like, it's not just the way that I want to provide financially for them. It's also like I grew up with a man that showed me that it's possible to go from 0 to the top. And I want to show my children that the same way, but without the sacrifice of health, without the sacrifice of relationships.
What is, if you're speaking to someone who's in that state of suffering, like you mentioned, what really motivates you is you don't want anyone to feel what you felt or to live through the suffering that you've lived through. And to stay in that suffering, the stress, the isolation, the loneliness, all of the things that so many men deal with. What's on the other side of that? What is the place that someone can get to?
Freedom to just be yourself. And it sounds so simple, but it's so enriching. It's like waking up without the thought of who you need to be and what you should be doing, and having the clarity and the confidence to do what you know is right for you. Whether that's moving to a different country, whether that's starting that business, whether that's speaking up in a meeting room, like speaking your truth or setting certain boundaries. It's following your heart, your bliss. And like the other day, 2 days ago, like one of my clients from the group, he sent me this message. He works for one of the big corporates here in the Netherlands, and he has always been so scared of really showing himself. So he did everything that like a middle-aged man should do, and working for one of the top 5 consultancy firms here. And then he was asked to speak at the event for the company with all the partners in front of him about mental health. And he decided to start sharing, like now he did the whole program to share his own personal journey. And it was the biggest liberation for him. It has been such a core moment to stand in front there with all the people in front of him that he thought that he needed to be someone else for, and now he was just himself sharing his story. So he could finally pause and hopefully stop playing that fake story of who he has to be. And now he has even a little bit more courage to start living his own story.
Yeah.
And that makes people dream, because he's now like, if I can do this, then what else can I do? So the world becomes bigger. The world becomes our own playground. And we're no longer restricted by by the chains of this conformist culture that just constantly tells us what we need to do, when we need to be doing it, by when we need to be doing it.
It's interesting you mentioned chains, and I think the mask that we often have to wear, particularly as men, there's so much around how we're supposed to show up, and all the kind of the toxic signals that we get in our culture of what it means to be a man. And the mask that we're supposed to wear, it really does feel like, chains or shackles or like a prison that we wear. And it's interesting, this concept of how liberating the freedom is to just be yourself and not have to hide anything. And I know a lot of the listeners, one of the big things around porn addiction is the shame that comes with it. Also with sexual abuse in the past, and there's so many things that can make us feel that sense of shame or hiding, or like we can't show up and just be ourselves. And it's hard to describe how liberating it is to live without that, because you kind of have to taste it.
It's to be seen for who you are, for who you truly are.
Yeah.
There's and I can speak to this, to this shame aspect. I went to the jungle last year. It's like I've been working with plant medicine for past 8 years, I think, or so. And last year I decided it was time to go to the jungle to spend a couple of weeks with the Shipibo healers. And at a certain night, I really had to work through that sexual abuse. And I thought like I had worked through it with a psychologist, but it was very much on an intellectual level. I understood what happened. I understood what it did to me, but it was still stuck in my emotional body. And that night, everything came out, and it was just like a 9-hour trauma release of just purging, shaking, screaming. It was horrendous. It was literally horrendous. And at the same time, I was smiling in between, because I knew that something greater was awakened and empowered within me. But in that moment, it was really, really horrendous. And everyone around me, the other 23 people that were there, they also knew what I was going through, because I was definitely taking over the show. which is another thing that I never liked doing because I was like, oh, I don't want to disturb and blah, 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 blah. But now it's just my time to get it all out. And then the next day we had an integration circle. And purpose of this integration circle is like if you went through a big experience that you learn to share what happened. So I raised my hand and I was like, this is the first time then that I'm going to share about this experience with the world, or at least with this little world that was in there right there. So I raised my hand and I noticed when I was speaking, I was looking to the ground and I could just feel like my liver, I could just feel my body like contracting and closing. And I was just really just speaking from my mind. I was admitting that I'd been sexually abused. I shared what happened that night and I was like, okay, over, basta. I don't want to talk about it anymore. And then one of the psychologists, one of the facilitators, she's like, Jordy, are you open to explore this a little further? And I could just feel like a knife stabbing in that liver. And I was like, yes, I am, because I knew this is why I'm here. And through my own awareness of my body and of the breath, I really tried to stay open. Every time I contracted, I had compassion for myself, and at the same time I was like, Jordy, stay open. So she started asking questions about when it happened in my life, what happened, what were the conditions, what was the impact that it had on you, what were your fears, what did you think that people would say about you if they would knew it and stuff. And so I learned, I started to open up and I started speaking about it, and my body constantly wanted to contract and close down. And with every word, every moment that passed, I could open a little bit more and I could allow myself to be seen, to be held by those other people who were just sitting there with so much love, with so much acceptance, and with so much respect. The very thing that I thought that I would never receive if they would really see me. And then this facilitator, she asked me, would it be okay for you to stand up and go around in the circle? So I had to face everyone, look them straight in the eyes, and they would say something beautiful to me and give me a hug. And I could literally feel just that entire protective mechanism breaking down. And I was breaking down. I was just crying and crying and crying. And that was the first time that I allowed myself to be fully seen. And the liberation that it has given me is, I can't describe it. Everything changed in my life afterwards. The way I relate to myself. So I could see myself as a man, which I couldn't before. I had many reasons to say that I was a grown-up man, but I could never feel it. And from that moment on, I related in a different way to myself, but therefore also to the world around me, to men, to women, to my clients. And just on an energetic level, everything started to take up. And I can't explain it. It's just because it's out of the body. It's just because I now, when I walk into a room, I'm like, see me, I have nothing to hide.
It's so liberating. First of all, I want to thank you for sharing that story, because I know it's not easy to talk about all of these things. And so many of the people listening to this will resonate, because with porn addiction, that shame of, if people knew X, Y, or Z, they would think I'm a monster. You know, all the different versions of that story of, if they really saw me, if they really knew what I got up to, then, you know, they would find out the truth that I'm not as put together, I'm not a man, whatever the story is. And one of my favorite quotes around this is, shame dies when stories are told in safe spaces.
Yeah.
And it's, you know, for myself, it took me so long to be able to open up around my porn addiction. You know, even, I mentioned this on the last podcast episode, but even after I had broken free from my addiction and wasn't looking at porn anymore, it still took me 6 years before I could mention to a single person that I ever even watched porn, because it was just so shameful. And it's such a weight that people carry. Whatever the shame is, it's a cage, it's a burden. And like you said, it's so liberating when you can share that story and be seen and still receive that love.
Yeah, it's beautiful what you share, and it's one of the main reasons that I predominantly focus on group work at the moment. Because people ask me like, but then the one-on-one work, is it more powerful? Well, yes, you get a lot more time with me one-on-one, so we can go much deeper. But the transformational aspect is the group sharing, is when we admit within a group that we struggle, is where we share our deepest fears. And we talk here about like the more heavier stuff of abuse and porn addiction. But the amount of men and even women that don't have a place, that don't know people where they can speak about the mental struggles that they have, about the anxiety that they experience, or the insecurities, or just the stress. They're just hiding it from the world, which is just such a normal thing, because we're all going through this. And that's like group work is just the work at the moment for me, because of this very reason, is that we get to share ourselves and that we allow ourselves to be seen and witnessed. And at the very end of the program, I do this exercise. I call it the all-seeing eye, which is basically allowing the participants to be seen, to see themselves through the eyes of others, by putting them on the spot and asking certain questions to the rest of the group. It's like, who do you see in front of you? What do you admire in it or her? What is his or her biggest fear? And so this person just sitting there, like completely vulnerable, and is just receiving the most beautiful, compassionate responses, which is probably one of the most healing things of this program, is for people to just be seen, to be witnessed, to be held.
Yeah. Being seen is such a healing power.
Yeah. And what we need is we just need more community.
What would you say to someone, because I know that I fully agree, and it feels like if there's one thing someone can do to start their healing journey, is to find people to open up to about it, to have that community, to have that space where they can share just honestly. What would you say to someone who feels like they don't have anyone in their life?
That's a lie. And that's the hard truth. They might not have someone they can reach out to right now, but almost anywhere in the world, and of course there are a few places where you can't and you don't, but almost anywhere in the world, you can find a men's group, you can find community meetings, and even if it's not around you, you can find it online. So I just say to that, it's a lie, and it's keeping you trapped in that victim mentality. I don't know anyone, I can't do this, I can't do that. I just wrote a whole newsletter about this. Like, what I've learned over these years is that like 99% of the I can'ts are I won'ts.
What would you say to someone who maybe knows that they can reach out? They know there's a men's group in their area, they have a friend, but the fear of opening that door, of opening Pandora's box and admitting their vulnerability is too scary for them.
You don't have to admit, you can just go, just sit. And even just say like, I can't open up yet. Because that will just reinforce the trauma that's there, is forcing someone to feel safe and share when they don't feel safe yet.
Yeah.
Go sit there, maybe go sit there for 6 months every week, just be part of the group, and maybe you start seeing other guys opening up about the struggles that they have, and probably at some point you will start feeling safe enough to share your struggle.
Yeah. When you see other people sharing,
yeah,
I think that's such a beautiful thing, is when you see other men, this can be anyone, but taking men's groups, when you see other men being vulnerable and admitting, their loneliness, their insecurity, And it's from afar, we might see them and think, oh, they've got it all together. They're never afraid. They're never lonely. And then you see them admitting like, yeah, I'm feeling lonely. I'm feeling afraid. I'm feeling insecure.
Yeah.
That's healing too.
That's also one of the reasons why I am so open and honest about my own journey and about the struggles that I still have. I say to people, I'm with you in the trenches. Like I'm not interested to pretend that I am all healed and got it all figured out. I don't. Like I just broke up with my partner. We had a beautiful relationship, but we couldn't work it out. We were incompatible. And so I don't have it all figured out. I also have my own struggles. And I openly talk about the sexual abuse. I openly talk about how I used alcohol and drugs as a way to cope with my grief, because it allows people to resonate with me. And I have so many other people coming to me, even about this sexual abuse. And it comes out weeks, sometimes months later when they're working with me. And they probably knew already from day one, but it just took them time. We're first going to work on other things. We're just first going to establish trust and safety. And then suddenly it's like, I got to tell you something.
I love, that your own vulnerability, your own sharing of your insecurities can also be a light for other people. It can be a source of inspiration.
Yeah. It's again, it's about permission. Like it gives them the permission to also share. And I hear this like when it comes to sexual abuse or drug abuse or whatever, I've heard people say like, I've just been so scared to go to a psychologist because I'm just afraid that they will not understand, that I will be judged. So they kind of want to go somewhere to someone who has experienced the same thing, that just knows how it is to walk in their shoes.
Yeah, I think it's one of the reasons, that I talk about my own porn addiction stuff, is I know that, like you said, you're the coach that you needed when you were 24. And for me, I needed someone who I knew would understand and wouldn't judge. And knowing that somebody has gone through porn addiction or whatever it is, it makes you feel safer.
Yeah.
You talk a lot about self-leadership. What does that mean?
So you take responsibility for your life. That's the first part, just coming back to it, that we need to admit is the first thing that it requires for us to get on this journey is to go from the character, the role of the victim, where we blame things outside of ourselves for the way we feel, and is taking back their responsibility and becoming the hero. Is saying, okay, hey, I'm in this is mine, I'm co-creating the situation, and I'm gonna overcome the challenge, the obstacle right in front of me. And in the end, to be self-led, what it means to me is that you have the awareness. So you have the clarity, the awareness, the confidence, and the courage to live a life in radical alignment with your values, so that you are free from those chains that we talked about, that you're free from the expectations of who you should be and what you should be doing, is that you're free from the constraints of today's society, is that you're free from all the assumptions and beliefs that keep you small and disconnected from your authentic self, that have been passed down from your family, is that you're just led by your own consciousness.
How does someone figure out their values?
Good question. I think one of the best ways is always to see where you experience the most resistance, because that's a sign that you're living out of alignment. And that's again, like, we need to lean into the pain, into the discomfort, into the resistance, because it's a gift. It's showing us where we're out of alignment.
What are some examples of resistance? Like, how do you tap into that? How do you know that that's resistance?
Well, one of the first things when it comes to values, like at the bottom of my hierarchy of values, there's vitality, which for me covers physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual resilience, health and resilience. one of the ways for me to understand that I live in alignment with is when I wake up and I feel energized, I feel optimistic, and I feel just ready. Like this morning, I just feel ready. I feel excited to come here. Like I have something to do that's meaningful to me. And my whole body, my whole mind, my entire emotional body is ready for this experience to come here. And I think one of the greatest ways to test this, like this resistance thing, is like when you wake up. Do you want to wake up? Do you want to wake up to reality? How do you feel about living your life? How do you feel about stepping out of your bed, stepping into your life? And so that's often the question that I have for people. It's like, how do you feel when you wake up?
How do you balance, and I'm asking, just for myself, this resistance, because I know that there are some times where I feel resistance and it's something that I need to lean into. For example, writing.
Mm-hmm.
I feel a lot of sense of meaning when I write, but I also feel a lot of resistance to sit down in front of the computer and start typing.
Mm. That's an interesting. I think you're more speaking about the discomfort of growth.
Mm.
So it's like when we're developing a new skill or we start doing something that's unfamiliar to us, we always feel a certain level of resistance because it triggers fear, it triggers insecurity. But I kind of like more speak about this ongoing resistance that we feel, the resistance towards life. And going back to waking up, I think snoozing, like if you just think about what are you snoozing from? What is it that you don't want to experience? Because I want to live, like I want to live every minute of my life. And it doesn't mean that I'm always on top of the mountain doing extraordinary things. I can find a lot of aliveness in very, very ordinary things. I can just be at home and be reading a book. I can just be spending time with my parents, with my little niece, with friends, doing mundane work. It can all be special, but I really want to wake up to it.
So it's almost like it's not necessarily the thing you're maximizing for. It's more of a sign of whether or not you're in alignment or whether you're starting to get out of alignment. Like you wake up and if you feel kind of like, I'm not so excited for today, it might be a sign that, hey, maybe something's out of alignment.
Yeah.
Almost like a symptom.
I think one of the most beautiful practices, and it's something we speak about today, like what I said, what happened in the jungle to my body is the contraction. And contraction is like when our shoulders start to bend and we almost feel like in our abdominal area, we feel like something is just gripping and pulling it down and pulling our shoulders forward. Is to contract and close. That feeling, the opposite is to expand and open. And one of the most beautiful practices just for a week is to become hyper aware when your body is opening and expanding and when your body is contracting and closing. Do it with the people around you. Like when you're meeting certain friends, are you opening up? Are you as a person expanding? Or are you closing down and contracting? When you walk into the office, when you work on a certain task, what do you feel? And get curious, so without a judgment, because maybe you're working on something new. Maybe you're starting a newsletter and writing is something you're still figuring out. You may feel some contraction. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't be doing it. But it does require you to get curious and maybe use your conscious awareness to remain open.
Yeah.
And maybe use some compassion to say, hey, let's write for 20 minutes. This is a big thing for me. Then take a break and we do another 20 minutes. But when you walk into the office every day and you experience contraction, you feel yourself closing down. That means that you're in the wrong environment. Your body is literally saying, hey, dude, this is not for you. And you can stay here, but the longer you stay here, the more you will have to give up from yourself.
So it's kind of learning to tune into the wisdom of the body, that the body really is sending us a lot of signals of what's in alignment for our life and what's out of alignment.
Yeah.
Just based off of Are we feeling at ease and expansive and
Yeah.
light, or are we feeling contracted and heavy?
Yeah, and it doesn't mean, like I just said it very black and white about like walking into the office, and if you feel that you're contracting and closing down day in, day out, it might be a sign that you're not in the right environment. It could also mean if you feel that within your relationship, it doesn't always mean that it's unhealthy, that it's toxic, that you need to go. It just is asking for your attention. It's asking for your curiosity. Why am I closing down? Which need and which values am I in conflict with? Maybe you need a little bit more space to yourself. Maybe you don't feel seen. Maybe you don't feel recognized. Maybe you don't feel valued by your partner. It just requires some attention and awareness to notice what is going on so you can do something with it.
I remember hearing, I forget where I heard this, but it was a talk about, I think it was antidepressants. And this psychologist was talking about how depression, so often we medicate away depression. But depression is actually, as you say, it's all of these things, depression, anxiety, contraction. They're signals that are just asking for our attention. Mm-hmm. And they're saying, something's not right. Mm-hmm. Something, to pay attention to. Something needs your attention. Whether it's depression or anxiety or lust. If we're talking about porn addiction, that moment of craving, it just needs your attention. And it's saying, hey, there might be some sexual craving going on. It might just be procrastination or boredom or some other emotional disturbance that wants your attention.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful what you say. I think burnout is often one of the first signals that you are in an environment that requires you to sacrifice your authenticity and needs. And authenticity sounds like a luxury, but it's really a survival need for us. So if we stay long enough in an environment where we have to wear a mask, where we have to pretend to be someone else, the bigger the gap between who we are and who we pretend to be, the more tension we experience. And it was Jim Carrey who said it about depression. Depression is a need for deep rest from the persona that we play out in our lives.
The inauthentic persona.
Yeah, the inauthentic persona, the one that's not us. And similar to burnout, like the amount of people that really think that burnout is just from working hard. I work really hard day in, day out, and I love it, and I can continue doing it. It's so sustainable because it's in alignment with who I am.
Yeah.
I move at a pace that's compatible with my human nature. I do things that are meaningful to me, like I solve problems that really matter to me. It matters to other people. It matters to the world. So I can keep going. But people don't think about it, and they're like, oh, I just need to recharge, and then I step back into the same environment and start repeating the same cycles. And then we come back to one of the topics that we discussed. Some people need to step back into that environment 3 times, 4 times, and then they get depressed to finally wake up. To finally be like, oh, maybe it's not me. Maybe I place myself over and over again in an environment that requires me to sacrifice my authenticity, to sacrifice my basic needs for sleep or for whatever.
I love this topic we keep coming back to, but just this, pain and suffering as a wake-up call. This kind of wake-up call to, hey, this lifestyle isn't working, this job isn't working, my relationship with the job isn't working. It's not a black or white, always thing, but just the awareness of saying, hey, this pain is pointing to something.
Yeah, and when is it enough? That's for the listeners.
Yeah.
How much more pain do you need to have to say it's enough? Do you really need to go to that moment of burnout, of chronic anxiety, of depression, of a breakup, of failure, of whatever, for you to change? Or can you listen to the more subtle signs of your body?
I love that. Just start paying attention to where is there that resistance? Where are you out of alignment?
Yeah. And that's the thing, like what I said, why my journey of stepping down as the CEO, becoming a nobody, and having to sit with all the insecurities and fears and shame and guilt that came up, and just sitting with it. So I was no longer afraid of those emotions. They were no longer unfamiliar to me. And now every time something comes up, it's more like a sign, hey, take a look at it. It's a sign of growth. It's a sign where I can become more whole.
If someone is on a healing journey, let's say they've had the courage to look within and they've admitted to themselves that their strategy isn't working, but they still feel stuck, what advice could you give to someone? Obviously, it's a big, you don't know anything about their circumstances, but let's say someone's listening to this and they're struggling with porn addiction and they know they need to change, but they just kind of keep going back to it. And, what would you say?
Go where you haven't been. That's one of the value statements that describes what it means for me to live in alignment with curiosity. And go where you haven't been doesn't mean that you necessarily need to travel the world. That can mean go to that men's circle where you haven't been. Go speak to a therapist if you've never done it. Go travel the world. Go to that place that you haven't been, experience a new culture. But stop trying to solve a problem with the same level of consciousness that created. And that's one of the quotes of Albert Einstein. We cannot solve our problems with the same level of consciousness that created it. So we need to upgrade ourselves. And we can only upgrade ourselves through new experiences. We need to stop repeating that process because it's just creating more suffering. So my advice to the listeners is go where you haven't been, whatever that means to you. But probably the best piece of advice is seek people around you.
Yeah.
That can guide you in some way. That doesn't necessarily have to be a coach. It can just also be friends or whatever, but just.
And I love, combining that with the wisdom you shared earlier of checking in with your body and noticing how you feel around different people.
Yeah.
And just, surround yourself with people where your body feels, light or at ease or expansive.
Yeah.
And just pay attention to, when I'm around these people, if you feel contracted, that might be a sign.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
Going back to what you said about try new things, one of the quotes I've heard, the definition of insanity is like hitting, I forget what it is, but running into a brick wall again and again and thinking at some point you'll go through.
It's doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result.
Yeah. And it's, if you want something you've never had, you have to do something you've never done. There's so much wisdom around this. Just do something different.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like in the coaching program, I often talk about crossing the river. And when I still lived back in Bali, my girlfriend and I, we had 4 dogs, and we found them all as puppies, as rescue puppies. And we always walked them on the beach. And when they're still pups, when we approach the river, they have a tendency to run away. They're scared because they've never crossed the river. It's a new experience. They're scared of the water. They're scared it's like the currents that goes into the ocean. And then I guide them through the river. It's scary. And once they get through the river, once they get on the other side, there's an excitement in their eyes. There's a sense of aliveness and a sense of confidence. And they just shake it off and they start running. And it's such a beautiful metaphor. It's just sometimes we just got to cross the river. And the river is the thing that we fear. And if we can't do it by ourselves, if it feels too scary, if we feel like a little puppy, we got to find someone who can help us cross that river. Someone who has crossed that river before and knows that it's just the easy thing. And then you learn that that river has never been your edge. It was just an illusion. And then you're free from that illusion and you're a bit more liberated, which then helps you to feel more confident about the next river that you encounter.
I can already see the parallels, thinking about going to a men's group, for example. And for many of the people listening to this, being vulnerable and sharing something vulnerable is a river that they don't want to cross. But just as with this analogy, it's like if you see somebody else walking across that river with confidence, and they're not afraid, and they're just walking across, gives you the confidence to do it. And so going to a men's group and seeing someone being vulnerable, it's like, oh, they have the confidence to cross this river.
Yeah, it just changes. In the end, it's all based on what we perceive to be normal. And if your reality has been that it's not normal to speak about your fears or about your insecurities or about your anxiety or about the pressure you experience at work or about how difficult it is for you to break free from the control of your mom or your dad, whatever it is, then that is your norm until you step into a new environment with different norms. And that's why I sometimes say to people that the best way to figure out your values is to move to a place where you meet people with a different set of values. Because it makes you rethink. You step into a new environment. And that environment can also be the men's circle, because that is already a different environment. For a new culture, we only need 2 more people.
Is there any quote or book or kind of thing that you heard that changed your life that you'd like to share? Something that made a big impact on you?
There are many things that made a big impact on me. I definitely want to, like Gabor Mate and Lawrence Heller, they've both been teachers of mine. I credit them a lot. They've been transformational for me. There's one quote that says, I forgot who it was, we can maybe share it in the bio. We can only grow, or our growth is directly proportional to the amount of truth that we can accept about ourselves. And that's one of my favorite quotes. And when it comes to a book, The Way of Integrity from Marta Beck. That has been one of the books, I've read it over and over again.
What is it about that book that had such an impact on you?
I recognize myself in her story. And the way of integrity, that's what I decided when I was in the hospital. I committed. I just didn't have the words back then to describe it in such a way, but I committed to walk the path of integrity. And what that means for me is to adhere to what I know to be right and true for myself. So that first because how do I know? That became my quest. I just knew what I thought to be right and true was not right and true. That wasn't working for me. So I had to figure it out by traveling around the world, by exploring all sorts of coaching programs, by diving into therapy, by going to the Amazon, by doing the work and eating my fair share of the humble pie. And now I know what's right and true for me. And I still have more to figure out, but it has become far more easy because the only thing I need right now is the courage to live in alignment with it. And that book just gave so much context to it. It was just like when I was reading it, it gave me such a a felt sense of safety in my body. Just a recognition of that's the journey that I've been walking.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the journey that I wish everyone to walk. And she speaks of Mount Integrity, and I think Mount Pleasure. And Mount Pleasure is when you start climbing Mount Pleasure, it's beautiful. You get popular, there's fame, it's comfortable, it's familiar, there's signs everywhere. So you don't really have to think, it's fun, there are clubs everywhere. But when you get to the top, the weather gets pretty bad, the view gets bad, it gets very steep, it gets very slippery. And that's where that's where the anxiety comes in, that's where the burnout comes in and whatsoever. So people choose that mountain because it's so comfortable at the beginning, whereas Mount Integrity is much harder at the start to climb, but the destination is far more beautiful.
Wow. I love this metaphor. It's so beautiful, like Mount Integrity and Mount Pleasure. And Mount Pleasure, especially the listeners of this podcast are going to resonate with this. It's enticing in the beginning. It's easy. It's pleasurable. But the higher up you get, it gets icy and cold and lonely, and it's a miserable mountain to be on.
Yeah.
And the opposite of that, Mount Integrity, it's not as enticing in the beginning. It's more difficult, rough terrain, but the promise of where it leads is so much healthier and better.
Yeah.
Wow, it's a beautiful analogy.
Yeah. Yeah, everything she writes in the book is just like, she has a background at Harvard, but the way she writes is just like, it's not scientific at all. It's just like, there's so much depth into it. She had a big journey herself. So I won't tell too much. Just dive into it.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
I'm definitely going to check it out. It sounds like a great book.
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you would want to pass on to the listeners? Any other words of wisdom?
I think in the theme of today is that struggle and pain is not supposed to be our default state. And even though you may look around you and you think it's our default state, it's not. And that I hope that by listening to us having this conversation, that it's a reminder for them that there's a different way. And that I hope that they find the courage to admit that they're struggling and to reach out for help in whatever way possible, is to cross that river. Because we only have one life. And there's a beautiful saying that says, and I often repeat this, it says, we have two lives, and the second one begins when we realize we only have one. And that happened for me when my best friend died. That happened for me when I was in the hospital and almost lost my own life. And that happened for me last year when I lost 3 friends. And it keeps reminding me, we only have a very short period of time. And it's just so profound, and coming back to wanting to wake up to reality. Yesterday I was walking through the dunes towards the beach, and I was just taking it in. It could have been such a dull moment where I would have just listened to a podcast and being preoccupied with thoughts. And it was one of those moments where I just looked around and I was like, fuck yes, it's such a gift to be alive. And that is my wish for the people that are listening, is to feel that again. To be reminded that we only have a short period of time here. That it's such a gift to be alive. And that it even comes with a responsibility to leave this place better than you found it.
There's a concept in Buddhism called spiritual urgency. It's this kind of recognition that, time here is short.
Yeah.
And to not procrastinate on, like you said, living a full life and just waking up to the gift that life is.
Yeah, I can only imagine one real hell that's much bigger than the hell that many people go through right now. And that's when your days are counted. Is knowing that you haven't lived your life to its fullest. That you've just been surviving. That you haven't tapped into your potential. That you haven't made a real impact in this world. And I think that feeling of not having explored your own unique potential, not having done any significant with it, I think that to me would be hell.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that's a beautiful kind of inspirational way to end. I think, hopefully people get that wake up call for themselves to say, I can't keep waiting on this. Like, knowing what's possible when you can live a full life, when you can wake up with excitement and say it's another day that I am excited to live. Yeah.
I deserve to live a fully lived life.
Yeah.
I would love the listeners to repeat that for themselves. Walk to a mirror, look at yourself, and say those words. I deserve to live a fully lived life.
I imagine what's hard for a lot of people is feeling unworthy. Feeling they don't deserve it. What would you say to someone who feels unworthy? Feels like they don't deserve it because of whatever they've done in the past?
Go do the work.
Go deserve it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Earn it.
Earn it and make peace with the past, because if I look back at the things that I've done in my life, I could say I wouldn't deserve anything anymore. And it's learning to embrace those experiences and looking at them through the lens of compassion that probably at the time, or even when it's happening right now, for the listeners, is you're doing the best you can with what you have until you know better, and then you can do better. And that's a principle for me that I apply, is that every time I learn from my experience and I know better, then I can do better. And that's when I have to do better. But every time before that point, I can't judge myself. I did the best I could with the consciousness I had at that point. And yeah, if you feel unworthy, then that's probably the door you need to enter. That's where you can open the door and start embracing it with courage, but most of all with curiosity and compassion. So you can heal that wound, so you can work towards forgiveness, forgiving yourself and setting yourself free again of the judgment you have towards yourself.
Beautiful. Well, final question. Where can people find out about you if they want to get in touch?
Best thing for people that are on Instagram is Jord Cuiper, JordCuiper. And people that hang out on LinkedIn, same. So those are the best places.
Yeah.
There, they can also sign up for my newsletter. It's a bi-weekly newsletter on self-leadership. Again, it's not the most light-hearted topics. It's like I'm not coddling. I don't do fluff stuff. It's just getting to the core and bringing awareness to the thoughts, to the patterns, to the coping mechanisms that really stop us from living that fully lived life. So yeah.
And I know you have a program coming up.
Yeah, my group program from the core. It's a 6-month program for only 8 people. It's starting on the 12th of July, and this week I will accept the last person in the group. So if anyone feels called, happy to jump on a call and see if it's something for them.
Nice. Yeah, we'll definitely link that in the show notes and get this out before then. All right. Well, thank you, Jord, for coming, and thank you, listeners, for joining us for another episode. It's really been a pleasure, and hopefully we'll do part 2 somewhere in South Africa.
That would be amazing. Yeah. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care. See you guys on the next episode.